Okay, let's unpack this. 2025 is shaping up to feel less like a predictable map and more like, well, uncharted territory, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It feels very dynamic. We've got major political shifts potentially coming in places like South Korea, Canada.
Right, and that's on top of the ongoing turbulence, Middle East, Ukraine, the South China Sea. It really feels like the ground is shifting.
It really does. And that kind of global instability is precisely why understanding these underlying risks is, I think, so critical right now.
Which is why we've really plunged into this recent Eurasia Group report. It was discussed in quite a compelling CBS News interview
Yeah.
with Ian Bremmer.
Yeah, the founder of Eurasia Group always has interesting insights.
Definitely. So think of this deep dive as your sort of backstage pass, if you will,
Yeah.
to understanding the major geopolitical dramas that might unfold. We're trying to get beyond the headlines here.
Exactly. We're aiming to pull out the crucial insights, give you a clear picture of the challenges, maybe some of the turning points we could see next year.
So our mission today, really cut through the noise, dig into the top 3 geopolitical risks Eurasia Group has flagged for 2025.
Okay.
We're talking the U.S.-China relationship potentially taking a nosedive.
Critical.
Then, what happens if a second Trump administration maybe operates with fewer guardrails?
That's a big question mark.
And the big one, this risk of a G0 world, a globe sort of adrift, no clear leader. You ready to get into the thick of it?
Absolutely. Let's start dissecting these. Where do you want to begin?
All right, let's kick off with risk number 3, as they list it. The potential fracturing of the U.S.-China relationship. It seems like a confusing picture, doesn't it?
It really does. You hear these mixed signals.
Yeah, like Trump potentially inviting Xi Jinping to the inauguration.
Right, a sort of personal diplomacy gesture.
But then you also hear these rumblings, pretty loud ones, about even higher tariffs on Chinese goods. So what's the real trajectory?
Well, what's fascinating, and Bremmer points this out, is the potential gap between, say, a leader's personal inclination, maybe Trump the deal maker, and the broader strategic currents.
Okay.
So even if there's an initial, friendly gesture, the report highlights a strong undercurrent within a potential Trump team favoring much more aggressive economic moves.
More aggressive than the first term.
Potentially, yes. And it's not just tariffs. It's a more hawkish stance on tech, on national security, areas where there's actually quite a bit of bipartisan agreement these days, too.
So even if, hypothetically, Trump himself wants some kind of deal, the people around him, the policy momentum, might push towards confrontation.
That seems to be the analysis.
Right.
Precisely. And then you look at it from Beijing's side. Bremer notes their current economic challenges. They're quite significant.
Right, the slowdown, property issues.
Exactly. And that seems to be pushing them to actively try and stabilize relationships elsewhere. Think India, Japan, Europe.
Mending fences where they can.
Kind of. But crucially, their expectations for any real improvement with the U.S. seem notably low. It's like they're already preparing for more friction.
So they're hedging their bets, basically. Building bridges elsewhere while bracing for more turbulence with Washington.
That's a good way to put it. Hedging their bets.
Okay, so if that's the dynamic, this mutual suspicion, these internal pressures, what's the likely outcome for this? Arguably the world's most important relationship in 2025.
The Eurasia Group forecast is pretty clear. A move towards greater confrontation, particularly on trade.
More tariffs, more restriction.
Likely, yes. And an acceleration of this decoupling idea, deliberately trying to reduce how much the two economies rely on each other.
Actively trying to pull apart.
Right. And naturally, that kind of economic tension almost inevitably spills over into national security. Heightened tensions there, too.
Does that include Taiwan? Is that where this heads?
Well, Bremer does suggest that maybe a direct military clash over Taiwan in 2025 itself might be less likely. Perhaps the risks are just too enormous for either side right now.
Okay, so Taiwan remains maybe the ultimate red line, even if everything else gets worse.
That seems to be the assessment. But the overall picture, it's one of the world's most crucial bilateral relationships heading into a significant downturn, a real weakening.
That's the key takeaway then. A considerable weakening expected in 2025. Okay, that's the U.S.-China piece. Let's pig it now to risk number 2.
Right.
The potential erosion of checks and balances on a second Trump administration. We saw constraints in his first term, internal ones, external ones. What makes 2025 potentially different?
Well, the core concern is really about a President-elect Trump perhaps feeling more emboldened facing fewer constraints both inside the U.S. system and externally.
And why fewer constraints externally?
The report points to the current global situation. You look at key U.S. allies, even adversaries, Canada, South Korea, Germany, France. Many are dealing with their own political changes, their own uncertainties.
It's like leadership transitions, domestic pressures.
Exactly. So this relative power dynamic could create a sense in Washington, or at least in a Trump White House, of having more freedom to act, more leeway.
So with other big players, maybe more inwardly focused, the U.S. might feel it has more room to maneuver unilaterally.
That's a key implication, yes. And Bremmer talks about how Trump seems to view unpredictability almost as a strategic asset, a strength.
Like keeping everyone off balance.
Precisely. He even mentions Elon Musk as another example, a powerful figure willing to really challenge norms, challenge other countries directly.
Interesting comparison. So what's the effect of that unpredictability?
It creates this situation where governments everywhere, allies and adversaries alike, are constantly scrambling, always in reactive mode, struggling to anticipate the next move, how to respond, or maybe how to work around the U.S.
Like a constant state of strategic whiplash. Makes long-term planning incredibly hard for everyone else, I imagine.
Incredibly hard, and the report uses this striking phrase. It contrasts the rule of law with the potential for a rule of dawn.
Rule of dawn, what does that mean?
It signifies this period of high unpredictability, where established rules, norms, agreements can potentially be overturned, almost overnight with little warning.
Wow.
And that, they argue, leads to significant instability, a lot of anxiety in the global marketplace, in diplomatic circles, all through 2025. It really throws a wrench into how international policy normally works.
Rule of dawn. That's evocative. Captures that feeling of potential upheaval, doesn't it? Constant uncertainty.
It does.
But the report hinted there might be some potential upsides to this scenario, at least from a U.S. perspective.
Yes, potentially, at least in the short term, for specific U.S. goals. Bremmer raises the possibility, for instance, that maybe there's a greater chance of a ceasefire in Ukraine under such conditions.
Totally why.
Perhaps the sheer unpredictability forces actors to reconsider their positions, or maybe a direct, less conventional negotiation style yields results. It's speculative, but possible.
Okay. Any other examples?
He also suggests Mexico might be more inclined to negotiate or make concessions when dealing with a less predictable U.S. administration.
Interesting. So a dose of American unpredictability could yield some tactical wins, maybe.
Potentially. But perhaps, the report implies, at the cost of broader global stability and trust in the long run.
Right. A trade-off. Okay, let's move to the number one risk then. The one that it sounds like kind of underpins everything else we've discussed.
Yes, the GZERO world.
The specter of a world lacking clear global leadership. Why is this considered the biggest one?
Well, the argument in the report is that the other risks, like the U.S.-China friction, like the uncertainty around U.S. policy, are in many ways symptoms of this larger underlying trend.
Okay, and what is that trend exactly?
It's the growing perception globally that the U.S. is either no longer willing or perhaps no longer able to play its traditional post-World War II role.
You mean like world's policeman?
That, yes, but also the primary architect of global free trade, the main promoter of shared democratic values, the rule of law internationally, that whole package.
Right, the America First idea signaling a more inward turn. But, okay, if the U.S. is potentially stepping back, why isn't China stepping up to fill that leadership void? They're obviously a huge global power.
That's a key question. And while China's influence is undeniably growing, the report suggests they aren't really positioned or maybe even willing to take on that kind of global leadership role, not in the way the U.S. has.
Why not?
Well, there are internal priorities, their own political system is different, there are questions about their intentions internationally. It limits their capacity or appetite for that broad U.S.-style leadership, so it leaves this vacuum.
Well, leadership vacuum at the top. And how are other major players reacting? Are we seeing, the Europeans or Japan or others trying to fill that gap?
Actually, quite the opposite, according to Bremmer. He describes a more defensive posture among most other significant players. Japan, South Korea, the UK, Canada, France.
Defensive how?
Their main focus seems to be on protecting their own interests, trying to mitigate the negative impacts from whatever the major powers, mostly the U.S. and China, might do. It's less about shaping a new global order and more about weathering the storm.
So everyone's kind of hunkering down.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of a global community tackling global problems.
Exactly. It's becoming more fragmented, more of an every nation for itself mentality.
Even though the biggest challenges we face, climate, pandemics, economic stability are global.
Precisely. The problems are global, but the responses are becoming increasingly localized, nationalistic. America first is just one example. You see analogs elsewhere, China first, India first, and so on.
And the consequence of this decline in global leadership, this fragmentation, it doesn't sound good for stability.
No, the report argues the crucial consequence is a weakening of the shared rules, the norms, the values that have, for decades, provided at least some degree of stability and predictability.
So what replaces that?
We shift towards a more dangerous international environment. One Bremmer characterizes using that phrase, the law of the jungle.
Law of the jungle. Meaning?
Meaning stronger nations feel more empowered to just act as they please based on their interests, with less regard for international law or norms, and weaker nations. They have little recourse but to comply or suffer the consequences.
That sounds like a recipe for more conflict, more instability.
That's the inherent risk. Yes, increased conflict potential.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the top 3 risks from Eurasia Group for 2025. Number 3, a seriously strained, possibly fracturing U.S.-China relationship.
Right, confrontation likely increasing.
Number 2, a potential second Trump administration operating with fewer checks and balances, injecting massive unpredictability, the rule of dawn.
Creating global anxiety.
And number 1, the overarching risk, the GZERO World, this lack of global leadership leading towards that law of the jungle.
Exactly. And it really feels like that G0 concept, that leadership vacuum, is the fundamental issue making the other risks worse.
Yeah, they all seem interconnected, don't they? Like the lack of leadership allows the U.S.-China tensions to fester and makes the impact of U.S. unpredictability even greater.
Precisely. The absence of that global anchor, or even just a collective commitment to tackling problems together, it just provides fertile ground for these other risks to grow and escalate.
This really makes you rethink some basic assumptions about international order. And building on that law of the jungle idea, here's something maybe for you, the listener, to think about. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, what are the real-world implications?
Right. For individual countries, big and small, for businesses, for just overall global stability, if this erosion of the established order keeps going, it's not just theory, is it?
No, not at all. That's the critical question to grapple with, I think. How might these shifts impact your own world, your own decisions, your outlook? The effects of a more disordered, less predictable world could be really far-reaching.
Well, this has certainly given us, and hopefully you, a powerful lens to view the year ahead. Understanding these potential fault lines, the ones the Eurasia Group has laid out, it feels like the essential first step.
Knowing the risks is key to navigating them.
Exactly. Navigating what looks set to be a remarkably unpredictable period. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
My pleasure. Important topics to discuss.